Thank you for joining us this morning for the 6th of our Selected for You webinars of 2022. As per the screen, this webinar is being recorded. Please do keep your cameras off and stay on mute until the questions, but there will be an opportunity to engage in the chat throughout the session. I'm Chris Withers. I'm the Broker Distribution Director for Ecclesiastical, and as I say, this is the 6th of our webinars so far this year. For those of you that have missed any of the other ones, then please do talk to your account manager about accessing a recording. But we've covered off mental health, we've covered coaching, we've covered training and competency frameworks, we've covered sales training, and we've covered social media so far today. Today, though, and I want to say a big thank you to those of you who have joined us today, because this one is about climate and net zero. And it's a topic that our own research has shown that the brokers know very little about, or very little about what's required of them. And so the fact that you have joined this webinar today shows that you're at least interested in finding out about it. And we suspect that you will, or we hope that you'll get a competitive advantage as a consequence of joining this early. Others, we suspect, will take some longer period of time to sort of join in, but that will be part of today's session. So we're joined today by Eunomia, who are the experts in this field that we've invited to talk to you. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Alex.
Thanks very much, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to meet you all virtually. Hopefully there'll be an opportunity to speak with one or two you later on as part of the Q&A session. Very pleased to be here today to talk to you all around this topic. And just to introduce myself, as Chris mentioned, I'm Alex Forrest from Eunomia Research and Consulting. I bring 20 years experience in environmental consultancy. The most recent, my most recent past is supporting businesses on decarbonisation. Not just businesses, we work with public sector organisations, national governments, but critically also SMEs. So we're working with a lot of the regional government programmes to help SMEs explore this topic, raise awareness, and understand what net zero means for individual businesses. I'm here today supported by my colleague Henrik. I'll just briefly hand over to Henrik to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, everybody. So I'm Henrik Mitschke, and similar to Alex, I have over 15 years in the industry, focusing a lot recently on decarbonisation and net zero pathways. The experience has been involving many years of supporting SMEs through various, as Alex says, government frameworks and private clients, SMEs, as well as looking at general carbon accounting for these organizations to get a better understanding of their impacts and investing in other things, amongst other things, renewable energy. Great. So delighted to be here today and to present or share some of that knowledge with you, hopefully.
Thanks, Henrik. So it'll be a bit of a double act this morning. This is what the objectives of the session look like. So at the front end of the session, I'll be leading these first two topics around climate science and terminology. So what does all this mean? We're hoping to distill some of the myths and just raise the level of understanding around what we mean by terms such as net zero, offsetting, carbon neutrality. What does all this mean? I'll also touch on some of the key agreements, the international and the national agreements that is supporting efforts towards net zero and decarbonisation in the context of what we need to do, what not just what businesses need to do, but what policy is needed in order to support businesses along this path. This obviously links into the conscious consumer arena as well. We're all trying to do our own bit. How do we bring that into a business setting? I'll then be handing over to Henrik to cover in more detail around what is expected of business in the UK, touching on what that means for you, so trying to contextualise what net zero and decarbonisation means for businesses. And we'll also pick up briefly on the role of brokers. So, how can you make a difference, and fundamentally, what are the benefits to your business? Chris has already touched on competitive advantage, but broader than that, what does it mean from a resilience point of view? and potentially, your wider stakeholders. So we'll run through all of that content. There will be time for Q&A towards the end. We're hoping to reserve about sort of 15 minutes for Q&A, which we'll manage through the chat function. Okay, so we'll move on. Chris has already touched on this, actually. A number of you will perhaps be aware that Ecclesiastical undertook a piece of independent research this year with the research agency FWD. It covered approximately 250 interviews with brokers with a view to understanding the baseline position around net zero, so attitudes, understanding barriers, for example, and what actions individual businesses are taking. So this is just some of the headlines, as you can see. You can read these for yourself, but just to pick up on one or two of these. So from the top, 26 believe that the insurance industry is doing enough to tackle climate change, just 26%. 40% need support to understand how it can reduce climate impact. And over 3/4 of brokers believe that reducing their company's climate impact is the right thing to do. So that's positives and negatives, I would say. For me, that suggests that there's a lot of appetite to do the right thing, to respond to the climate emergency, but fundamentally, it's around helping businesses along this path. The main barrier to setting net zero targets coming out of the research is that brokers don't necessarily have the resources to focus in on this area. 62%, so 2/3 of businesses suggesting that the main barriers are around resources, and that actually chimes with the research that we have undertaken as a business for different regional business support organisations, reflecting the fact that a lot of the issues around this is resources. Finally, 21% of nationals are measuring carbon footprints compared to 2% for regionals or 1% of provisionals. And again, that chimes with national research conducted by the Federation of Small Businesses that suggests that more broadly across different industry sectors, whilst national organisations are making progress and measuring carbon footprints, a lot of times the smaller businesses, the SMEs, even the medium-sized businesses are really struggling to understand what their baseline position is. So hopefully today, as I say, the intention is to try and increase awareness and understanding around this topic, whilst also picking up some of the quick wins that businesses can take in order to make progress and undertake activity around this area. But before we get into that, our intention is just to run a bit of an icebreaker, really, just to understand why you're here today and what you consider to be the reasons for attending. And we frame this in this question here, which you can respond to via the chat function, which Henrik will monitor. We'll very briefly reflect on some of the responses that come through. I'm conscious that we haven't got massive amounts of time. This isn't going to be an academic poll, but we want you to just spend a few minutes thinking about why being carbon literate is important to you. As I say, type that in the chat function. We'll give you a few seconds to think about that. And at that point, we'll just review some of the responses, and Henrik will monitor those responses and just reflect back on some of those answers. So we'll give you a few seconds to think about that. I'm also aware that you might not necessarily know why being carbon literate is important to you, so that might be one response to consider. How are we doing, Henrik? We seeing
only had one response, and it is focusing on responsibility. So feeling both personal and professional responsibility. Well, there's a few coming in now, actually. Again, responsibilities seems and future generations, which links back to responsibility, seems to be the main theme running through the answers.
Great. I mean, all things that I'm sure we can all relate to. I myself, as an environmental consultant, are in the game for all of those reasons. So yeah, being responsible citizens, responsible actors is absolutely something that I'm sure we can all relate to. Okay, thanks all for those contributions. We'll move on. Another quick icebreaker, just to get a sense of the level of understanding in the room, really, around net zero. So a quick poll question, which again we'll use the chat function for. At this time, the question is, how confident are you in your knowledge of what net zero means for you and your business? So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being no confidence at all, 5 being extremely confident. So again, we'll give you a few seconds just to think about that question and your response, and Henrik will again monitor those responses as they come through. How are we doing, Henrik?
Yeah, there are quite a few more responses to this one, and I would say it's fairly evenly split, with a 3 slightly pipping it over 2. So it's hopefully after today we can improve on that, but it's sitting between 2 and 3, 2.5, I would say, averaging.
Okay, great. Well, that's useful context, and it's useful in to have that understanding as we go through the slide content. I would say that this session is pitched really at sort of entry level carbon literacy training. We undertake a number of these different sessions, and you can spend whole days going through carbon literacy workshops and training, building understanding through different tutorials. So we only have 40 minutes. It's pitched at a relatively high level, and I think Chris might have mentioned that there will be a further follow-up session in order to maybe sort of drill into some of the detail around these topics if that's of interest. So again, thanks all for your contributions. Quick round of mythbusters here. So again, there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinterpretation of climate and what it means for different actors. Again, this is just a quick. We're not going to use the poll, the chat function to this, but it's an opportunity just to sort of run through a quick round of myths and try and distill some of these. So number 1, the Earth's climate has always changed. Is that true or false? The answer to that, it's true. The climate has always changed, but what we're seeing now is a rapid warming that can't be necessarily explained by natural cycles of warming and cooling. What we're seeing is the kind of change that will normally happen over thousands of years, but what we're seeing is these changes happening in decades rather than thousands of years. So I don't know whether some of you saw the article in the news this week. Actually, it was a French video of a weatherman back in 2014 predicting what French temperatures would look like in 2040. There were hot spots around Bordeaux of 40 degrees temperature. So they were predicting what the temperature would look like in decades to come. This is happening now. The climate has always changed, but it's happening much quicker than we anticipated. So number 2, climate change will only affect the planet in future years. True or false? I think I probably answered that in the first one. As I say, we're seeing change much sooner than envisaged. We're already seeing the effects of climate change on food chains, food supplies, conflict mitigation, global instability around the world. Man-made climate change is the biggest environmental crisis of our time. Number 3, emissions are mainly China's faults, hence they need to act first. True or false? It's true to say that China's national grid actually still relies heavily on coal, and therefore for any of the products that we buy from China, they have a much higher carbon footprint because they rely heavily on coal. And other countries such as the UK and the US are decarbonising their grids a lot quicker. But it's important to say that countries like ourselves have contributed way more to climate breakdown than China in years before. So we need to remember this, and we need to remember that we're all connected and we all have a role to play. And at this point, it's just useful to touch on a couple of quotes. I could have put on a number of quotes, any number of quotes here, but I've chosen one by Barack Obama. if you're thinking about an influential man of the time, I can't think about anyone more influential than the former US president. So he said that we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it. And I think that's useful to putting this all in context. You know, we're aware of the problem, we're already seeing the change, and we know what we need to do in order to solve this problem, but it's going to require us all pulling together, you know, politicians, business leaders, consumers, householders, in order to deliver this change that we need. Secondly, we've got a quote here from Andy Briggs, chair of the Association of British Insurers. The impact of climate change is one of the biggest global issues of today, and it is essential that we as an industry are taking action to tackle this and drive positive change. So again, putting it in the context of the insurance industry are recognising this as a global challenge, and one that the insurance industry needs to play a role in tackling. So just to sort of frame this really in the context of why we're here today. So I wanted to briefly just touch on some of the science and the terminology around all this. As I said earlier, there's a lot of confusion around climate literacy as a topic. This is probably the dry bit of the presentation, I would say, but I think it's important just so that we're all on the same page around some of the terms and the definitions that are important in the context of climate. You know, if you look up any glossary, you know, for climate change, you'll find a very long list of academic terms. This is really just to touch on a few key terms, just to ensure that we're all on the same page around a few of these key terms. So greenhouse gases, what do we mean by greenhouse gases? A lot of emphasis is placed on carbon as one of the primary carbon greenhouse gases, and rightly so. You know, carbon arises from the fossil fuels, the oil and gas, the coal that we've been reliant on for decades since the Industrial Revolution. But in addition to carbon, there are other emission sources that are equally important. Methane, for example. Methane arises from cattle. It arises from poor waste management systems where waste isn't recycled or composted. So it's important to understand that other gases like methane are incredibly important. Methane has a 25 times higher impact than carbon. So just important to understand that it's not just all about carbon emissions. Net zero. What do we mean by net zero? Net zero is often bandied about, and our experience is that, you know, often our clients, organisations are declaring net zero targets without necessarily understanding what that means. Net zero by 2050, net zero by 2040 or 2030, is that achievable? When we talk about net zero, what we're talking about is when emissions from human sources emitted to the atmosphere are balanced by removals over a specified period, and that the key words here I've underlined is balanced and removals. So a lot of emphasis needs to be around reducing our carbon emissions, reducing our greenhouse emissions, rather than just offsetting. We can't offset our way out of this. Offsetting is a term often referred to as planting trees, for example. That is important. We won't get to net zero without offsetting, but fundamentally what we need to focus in on is reducing our emissions. Carbon neutral. Net zero and carbon neutral are often wrongly used interchangeably. Carbon neutral really refers to a balance between emitting carbon and absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. It's often referred to in the context of limited greenhouse gas emissions, which is unlike net zero. So, for example, you might see products purporting to be carbon neutral. It's often used to describe a product or a service rather than the whole organisation. If you look at emissions arising from a whole organisation, it's not just necessarily about the product or service. Decarbonisation. So this is a process where countries, individuals or entities achieve zero fossil fuel carbon existence. So an example of this is, you know, efforts to decarbonise the grid. As I mentioned earlier, the UK is perhaps more advanced in that compared to other countries. We're decarbonising our national grid faster than others. Offsetting, and I mentioned this earlier as well. So this is, as I'm sure you'll be aware, many of you will be aware, is a process by which we compensate for our emission into the atmosphere. An example, as I mentioned, is tree planting, but I would say that offsetting represents an important part of any net zero strategy, but it's absolutely not the solution. And what we try to do is work with clients to educate who come to us often wanting to be carbon neutral or wanting to get towards net zero, without necessarily understanding that first and foremost efforts need to be driven to reduce carbon emissions before we think about offsetting. It does have a role, but it's not the solution. Mitigation. This refers to efforts to reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions. So an example would be replacing fossil fuels with renewables. And adaptation. So this is where we adjust natural or human systems in response to climate change. An example of this might be building seawalls or recycling water in response to drought. So just a very quick summary of some of the key terms which we think are important for all stakeholders to understand. As I say, there's a very long list of different terms which we can share if that's of interest as part of a follow-up series of slides. So climate science, what is happening? I've chosen this infographic actually because as of yesterday, yesterday is actually an important day in climate terms. Every year, it's coined "Show Us Your Stripes Day" in order to raise awareness. Companies and NGOs globally decide to share this infographic, and there might be different variations. This is a UK example. You can actually download hundreds of versions. You can localize it. You can produce a global infographic. As I say, I'm showing this today because yesterday was the day in which different stakeholders choose to reflect what is happening in climate terms. So this really illustrates the point that, you know, since the Industrial Revolution, we've continued to use fossil fuels, and in response to that, you know, the last 10 years in particular have been the hottest year on record. So if there's any misconceptions around whether, you know, climate change is happening, I think this is a good illustration of that point. You know, the world is getting hotter. There's been blips. There are some natural occurrences of warming in historical years, but what we're seeing is man-made change of the climate. In terms of sources, I'm not going to labour on this too long, but just to sort of pick up on some of the key points here around that every sector of the economy is partly responsible for emissions, and we're going to require all areas of the economy, all sectors, all subsectors to make significant emission reduction in order to achieve net zero. Obviously, the energy sector is a major role to play, which naturally touches on all sectors of the economy. I mentioned decarbonisation of the grid is happening, but fundamentally we need all areas of the economy to decarbonise their organisations and their systems in order to deliver on net zero. I mean, I've chosen this slide really just to sort of pick up on and sort of synthesize really some of the consequences. We're seeing images like this almost on a weekly or a monthly basis right now. There's perhaps too many examples to pick up on. One of the key things to reflect here is that since the Paris Agreement, I'll touch on some of the agreements in later slides, but since the Paris Agreement, which was adopted by approximately 200 countries around the world, this has set a new goal for us to ensure that global warming is kept well below 2 degrees. Ideally, we keep it at 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees is a target that many are aiming for. I mean, what we can see on the left-hand side here is the impacts across different metrics on what that means for biodiversity, for droughts, for sea level rise, flooding, and so on and so forth. If we maintain 1.5 degrees warming, 2 degrees and beyond, you can see that the impacts across all of these different themes is going to be significant, and we're seeing it right now. We're at the point now where we need to consider adaptation alongside carbon reduction. But I guess the key message to stress here is that we need to maintain global heating below 2 degrees and ideally at 1.5. And just to touch on this slide as well, I mean, I'm not going to labour this too much because I think a picture tells 1,000 words. This highlights the forecasted consequences of climate change from a flooding perspective by 2050. Picking out sort of key areas of the UK, we've got London at the top, Cardiff and the northeast here. So this is reflecting the red areas is reflecting areas that are forecast to be below water level by 2050 if we don't act. So visually, in the context of today, in the context of insurance, I'm sure you'll agree, quite a powerful slide. I mentioned that we'll touch on some of the key dates. I mean, I'm not going to go through this in detail, just sort of picking out one or two key dates for you to be aware of. I'm sure that, all of you would have, you couldn't ignore COP26 in the lead up to 2021. Media was very heavy around the need to act, focusing on promises and pledges made by the business community, by national governments, supranational governments, including the EU. Where we are now is that we are fast forwarding from COP 26 onto COP 27, which will be in Egypt later this year. What we're wanting to do is, if we want to see governments making good on their commitments, we're already seeing the UK government moving towards mandatory requirements for all businesses that do more than £5 million worth of business through the UK government, requiring them to have a net zero strategy in place. And we're starting to see evidence that that's cascading through the supply chains to medium-sized businesses as well. So there's a lot to do in summary, but we all need to play our part. I've chosen this slide to just convey really the fact that I think we're all starting to act as conscious consumers in the home, the way we act, the way we shop, the way we eat. In my mind, we need to sort of take that behaviour into the workplace and really look for the opportunities around how and where we can have a positive impact to reduce all of our emissions within a business setting. So at this point, I'll hand over to Henrik. Henrik will take you through the second part of the session.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that, Alex. That was a great introduction. So we've now discussed the science, policy, market, and the need for us to play a part. And this next section will build on that and discuss what role the brokers can play in limiting emissions and therefore the negative impacts and inevitable consequences. So what does it mean for your business? Well, we can see here that the UK government announced its ambition to become the world's first net zero aligned financial centre in 2021. There are several parameters associated with how they propose to transition, and these are listed below. These are putting quite a bit of pressure on insurers, brokers, and other major financial institutions to treat climate change as a top risk and transition to more sustainable activities. An example of how industry is reacting is the Association of British Insurers, for example, who have set specific emission reduction targets and net zero targets. And both of the above is affecting how insurers and brokers are developing their business and environmental strategies. Next slide, please, Alex. We now have another activity for you, a short one, and we'd like to do similarly as before, a quick poll in the chat. If you could please say what you think the benefits are for you and your business in progressing towards net zero. Just give you, as before, just a few seconds to do that. There seems to be unanimous D's all around, so that's interesting and very good. Thank you very much for your contribution there. You could have the next slide, please, Alex.
It keeps ticking for some reason.
Yes, it's ticking again. So Well, it gives you an opportunity to read those options again, or the benefits. Apologies for the technical glitch. There we go. Thank you. So as we say, the poll indicated all of the above. So there are several benefits to being at the forefront of the net zero agenda. So you can have a competitive advantage in response to an increasingly higher client awareness and expectation. You can future-proof your business against policy and market changes. So policy is clear in prioritizing net zero activities, as Alex alluded to. And the energy market is very volatile, which we've seen over the last year. So if you have a net zero agenda, then you're well placed to cope with future changes in current policy, but also in the energy market. And also net zero plans will make you appear less risky and therefore more attractive to investors. You can future-proof your business against physical, transition, and liability risks related to climate change. Alex explained there were several physical and transitional risks from climate change, so having a net zero agenda will help protect you against this. And it can attract and retain talent. So there's quite a lot of data linked on the right there, which suggests an increasing number of the workforce is seeking to align themselves with ecologically conscious companies, and those that have an environmental or net zero strategy. So it's important in retaining the workforce. And it can provide positive PR opportunities for your business. So reducing your carbon footprint and shouting about it, particularly via your marketing channels, will help boost your brand image. So get the next slide, please, Alex. So what is expected of businesses? Well, for the UK to achieve net zero by 2050, we know that government policy and UK corporate action needs to continue to reduce emissions at pace and at scale. The Climate Change Committee has listed a series of contributions that are expected from businesses. Now, I'll only pick a few of these as they're not all directly relevant, but these include, for example, decarbonising operations. So reducing your direct and indirect emissions by switching to low or zero carbon alternatives, nudging employees and customers to make net zero decisions. So customers can empower employees and support them to make lifestyle choices. We'll cover customer interactions a bit more detail later on. And they can leverage procurement. So understanding the impacts of and working with supply chains to ensure that your organization is purchasing low carbon goods and services can also help. Next slide, please. Where do we start? The first step is really to measuring your carbon footprint. Look at setting a net zero target for your own organization, then working towards that net zero target. And separate to that, you can look to support employees in their own transition, but also promoting to clients what you're doing to reach net zero to make yourself more appealing. Can we have the next slide, please? So the first step that I mentioned in the previous slide was measuring your organization's carbon footprint. Well, what's meant with that? Well, a carbon footprint is a measure of the total greenhouse gas emissions caused directly and indirectly by a person, organization, event, or product. Quantifying these greenhouse gas emission sources helps you understand your organization's impact, but also it identifies hotspots to focus how you reduce your impacts. Emission sources are often categorized into scopes. So the graphic there on the right-hand side tries to illustrate that. And these can be direct. So for example, scope 1, which accounts for the direct emissions associated with organizations or people burning fossil fuels or consuming refrigerants. It can also be indirect, such as scope 2, which looks at the accounting for the emissions that are produced when generating electricity that you subsequently consume. Or it could be indirect under scope 3, which looks at those emissions that are generated for producing products that you purchase, and as well as emissions associated with transporting those products to you or elsewhere in your supply chain. With the next slide, please. So the next step I mentioned was to set a net zero target. So we've identified already through the carbon footprint which parts of the business emit greenhouse gas emissions. We then need to collect data on that. And so those emission sources, the data from those emission sources is collected through things such as kilowatt hours, if it's electricity, or the amount of water consumed. That data then needs to be converted to effectively carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Alex mentioned earlier on about the different types of greenhouse gases, but for the purposes of carbon accounting, one tends to relate to tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So you need to convert that data to get an equivalent carbon dioxide emission. Once you quantify that, you can look at setting a net zero target. So you know how much carbon dioxide equivalent emissions you have. So you can set a target and saying, well, in 5 years' time, we would like to reduce that by X%, etc., moving towards a target that is no later than 2050. A key point to make here is that there are several different reporting frameworks that can provide guidance on how to set a target and go about it. But that's for another day, and perhaps one of the one-to-one sessions that we could have or future webinars we could have to discuss. Once you set that target, you want to develop a strategy to meet your net zero target. Go to the next slide, please. So the key thing to really mention here is that you've developed a net zero target and you've got a strategy for doing it. But the key is to really focus on quick wins. As Alex has mentioned, this is, we all know that you are SMEs, so you can't change the world in one go. The key then is therefore to tackle the big emitters that you've identified as part of your sources and what is simple and feasible first. Doing that first will allow you to get a grapple on what your organization is doing. And that includes things like insulating buildings, switching to clean energy, because that actually has a zero impact, a zero emissions factor for your electricity. You can consider generating your own energy, change your lighting. It's surprisingly a lot of energy is consumed for that, as well as optimizing your heating and cooling. No point doing that really until you've insulated your buildings. Reduce your waste and recycle. And then finally, thinking about what you buy. So linking back to that committee of climate change and the leveraging procurement. Have the next slide, please, Alex. So there's a lot of concepts and processes that Alex and I have mentioned. So it's good to also point out that there are several available resources. Going back to that original slide that Alex where he summarized the survey, a lot of the participants said that they didn't know how to do it and didn't know where to find resources. Well, here are some resources. We are sharing the slide deck afterwards, and at the end of the slide deck, you will have a list of all the links to these various resources and other terminology and concept that have been mentioned throughout the presentation. So don't worry if you're not taking a screenshot of this or anything. It'll be part of the slide deck at the end. Have the next slide, please, Alex. So as I mentioned earlier on, we were talking about the concept of nudging the employees as well as customers. So wanting to delve into that a little bit more here, in the sense that we can see that organizations such as the London and International Insurance Brokers Association recognize the role that brokers can play. Now, I also recognize that LIBA represent large brokers. But I think the key thing here is that it contextualizes what climate commitment and action in the broker sector is moving towards. And if you look at the graphic on your right, you can see that there are several things that brokers can do. So picking a few, you have the power to engage with customers to understand the need for new products and services. You can create propositions for sustainable products and services, thereby nudging customers to make more sustainable decisions. And you can prompt clients to take action to ensure the products customers want are being delivered. Again, there's quite a bit of literature there that you could look through on your own time to get more context, and that is again going to be available in the slide deck at the end. Could I have the next slide, please, Alex? Now, today we've been discussing a lot about what you can do and it all may seem a little bit theoretical. So we thought it'd be important to share an example of insurers that are active in the sustainability space. And one of these is Nature Save Insurance. So you can see on the lovely graphic there on the right that some of the actions that this company has taken. So they're currently producing a net zero plan. And as part of that, they're providing specialist insurance cover for renewable energy projects. So again, this is sort of linking into the earlier slide about what brokers can do in terms of being that interface between clients and customers, and really helping to shape what type of products are being presented. And they are also offering customers discounts for adopting measures such as loft insurance and double glazing. Going back to the sort of quick win slide, whereby the first point was insulate your buildings. That's your loft insulation and double glazing. The next slide, please, Alex. So on that little whistle stop tour, what other sort of key messages of today before we head into the Q&A? We have established that climate change is driven by greenhouse gas emissions. The UK government is aiming to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Every part of the economy, including the finance sector, will be required to have a plan and act on it. And that's becoming far more prevalent now in the last year or so. Starting your journey towards net zero can help future-proof your organization. Seem to be unanimous in the chat that everybody recognized that. But starting on your journey can help you gain a competitive advantage as well. So we started off with a quote, and we thought we should perhaps look to finish with a quote. And this is from the vision of the Climate Action Pathway financed through United Nations. And their vision is that by 2050, financial markets, institutions, and systems are in place to support and fund a resilient zero carbon economy and society, ensuring that temperature rises remain limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above 1990 levels. And as a result, flows of capital have been redirected to sustainable and climate resilient development. So it's quite a big vision, but I think one that is perfectly achievable if we start, as seems to be identified in the chat as well, recognizing responsibility and the benefits that it can have to your business.